She woke up before the sun, as she always did. The small room she called home smelled faintly of damp wood and dust. It was quiet, except for the distant sounds of the city stirring awake the rumble of engines. The occasional shout from a vendor and the clatter of carts being pushed across the narrow streets. For her, this quiet was both a comfort and a reminder. Comfort, because it gave her a few moments to gather her thoughts. Reminder, because every day was a fight. She didn't ask for it, but couldn't escape. She pulled on the thin jacket she had worn for months. It was faded, with a few small tears along the sleeves. She didn't own many clothes, but she had learned to make what she had last. Her shoes were even worse. The soles were almost gone, leaving her feet sore after a few hours of walking. Still, she put them on. Walking barefoot was dangerous in the city. She could not risk even a small cut turning into something worse. Outside, the world moved fast. People hurried past her, faces buried in their phones or in their own thoughts. Some glanced at her with annoyance, some with pity, and many with nothing at all. She had grown used to being invisible. That was her way of surviving. If people didn't notice her, maybe they wouldn't judge her. Maybe they wouldn't blame her for the life she had no choice in. Her first stop was the small cafe near the corner where she had been allowed to work. A few hours cleaning tables and washing dishes. The owner did not pay much, but he paid something. For now, it was enough to buy her a small loaf of bread and a little butter. She moved silently through the cafe, careful not to bump into anyone. The floors were wet from the morning mop, and one wrong step could ruin everything. She had learned to navigate this space like a dance, each step measured, each movement precise. The cafe smelled warm and comforting. Bread, coffee, and the faint hint of cinnamon from the pastries. She allowed herself a small smile as she cleaned the tables. For a few moments, it felt like the world wasn't against her. She stacked plates carefully, wiped the tables, and swept the crumbs into a small pile. The cafe owner called out occasionally, giving her instructions or a nod of acknowledgement. He was not unkind, but he was busy, and she did not expect more from him. After finishing her work, she left quietly. The sun had risen higher now, casting long shadows across the streets. She walked through the narrow alleys, careful to avoid the people who shouted at beggars or threw coins at stray dogs. Sometimes she wondered if the world had always been so harsh, or if it had just grown harder since she had started noticing it. Hunger was one thing. Cold was one thing. But the cruelty she saw in the faces of strangers weighed more heavily than anything else. Her journey that day took her behind a large event hall. A wedding was being set up, and the streets were busy with workers, deliveries, and decorations. The smell of flowers mixed with food drifting from inside. She stayed close to the walls, hoping not to be noticed. Her task was simple. She had heard from someone in the neighborhood that valuable items were often left in the back alley, discarded or forgotten. Sometimes she could find something to sell. Sometimes she could find something to use. Either way, it was better than going home empty, dash-handed, as she moved carefully among the piles of garbage and discarded items. She felt a tap on her shoulder. She jumped slightly and turned to see a security guard. His uniform was crisp, and his eyes were sharp. He looked at her as if she had done something terrible, though she had done nothing at all. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. His voice was harsh, carrying the weight of authority and suspicion. "I'm just looking," she said softly. "I wasn't taking anything. I was just—" She trailed off, not sure how to explain herself. She knew that words were useless in situations like this. People did not care about explanations. They cared about appearances. And she, in her worn clothes and thin jacket, looked guilty no matter what she said. The guard frowned and motioned for her to follow him. Panic fluttered in her chest. She had been in trouble before, but never like this. She tried to explain, to tell him she meant no harm, but he didn't listen. His face was hard, and his eyes did not soften. He called for another guard. Together, they led her toward the back of the building. Fear gripped her, but she did not scream. Screaming would only make things worse. Instead, she followed quietly, her mind racing with questions. Why was this happening? What had she done wrong? She knew the world was unfair. But she had never imagined something like this. The guard stopped at a large, rusted metal door. Behind it was a space she had never seen before, filled with old trash bins, broken furniture, and piles of debris. They shoved her inside. "Stay here," one of them barked. "Maybe this will teach you a lesson." Then they slammed the door shut. Darkness swallowed her. She stumbled, her hands reaching out for anything solid. The smell was unbearable, rotting food, mold, and decay. She gagged, but forced herself to breathe through her mouth. Her heart pounded, and tears blurred her vision. She called out, her voice cracking. "Please, somebody help me." Minutes passed. No one answered. The only sound was the soft scurrying of rats and the distant echo of voices from the event hall. She sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees. She had never felt so alone. Every day had been hard, but this felt different. This was not hunger, not cold. This was cruelty, pure and deliberate. She thought of her mother, who had worked herself to exhaustion just to keep a small roof over their heads. She thought of her little brother, who waited for her at home, not knowing she would be late. She had always believed in kindness, even when it was scarce. But sitting in that pit, surrounded by trash and darkness, she began to wonder if kindness was just a story people told to make themselves feel better. Outside, life went on. She could hear the music from the wedding, the laughter, the clinking of glasses. It felt like another world, one she could never enter. The contrast was cruel. People celebrated, ate, and enjoyed luxuries she could only dream of. And yet, she was not angry at them. She was angry at the world that allowed such inequality, a world that punished her for being poor and nothing else. Hours passed. She tried to keep herself busy, moving around the small space, finding bits of discarded paper to clean or rearrange. She whispered stories to herself, inventing friends and adventures to keep the fear at bay. She told herself she was strong, that she would survive, that someone would eventually find her. Then, faintly, she heard a sound from above. A voice? Footsteps? She could not be sure. She froze, listening. Her heart leaped. Maybe it was someone coming to help. Maybe this nightmare would end. But the footsteps moved away, leaving only silence once more. Disappointment washed over her, heavier than hunger or cold. She pressed herself against the wall, trying not to cry, trying not to give up. She thought about what life had taught her. It had taught her to be careful, to be quiet, to avoid trouble. But it had not taught her to hide from cruelty, only to survive it. She remembered the small acts of kindness she had seen. An old man sharing bread with a stray dog. A neighbor giving her a coat when winter was cruel. Those memories gave her a small spark of hope, a reminder that not everything was lost. As the day wore on, her mind drifted. She imagined a world where she could walk freely, where people judged her by her heart, not her clothes. She imagined a life where she did not have to fear every step, every glance. She imagined a moment when she could be seen, truly seen, not as a problem or a poor girl, but as a human being deserving of respect. But reality was harsh. The darkness around her pressed in, the smell of decay lingered, and the uncertainty gnawed at her courage. She shivered, both from the cold and from fear, but she did not cry, not yet. She had survived this long, and she could survive a little longer. As evening approached, the city lights flickered in the distance. The sounds of celebration grew softer as the wedding continued inside. She closed her eyes, imagining the music as a song just for her. A reminder that life outside still moved forward, that hope still existed somewhere beyond the walls of the pit. She promised herself she would not give up. Not today, not ever. No matter how cruel the world was, no matter how many times people tried to push her down, she would keep going. Somewhere, somehow, someone would see her. And until that moment, she would hold on to the smallest things. Memories, dreams, hope. The darkness was complete now. She could not see her hands in front of her face. She could not hear anything except the soft rustle of debris and the distant echoes of the world outside. But she could feel it, the quiet strength inside her, the determination that had carried her through every hardship. And even in that moment of despair, she whispered to herself, "I will not be forgotten." I will survive. The darkness in the pit pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. She had been trapped there for hours, though time seemed to move strangely in that space. Minutes stretched into what felt like lifetimes. Her legs were stiff, her arms sore from holding herself upright, and the smell of decay never left her nose. But she refused to give in to despair entirely. She whispered to herself, telling small stories in her mind, imagining a world far from this pit, a world where she could breathe freely and walk without fear. Her stomach growled loudly, reminding her of her hunger. She had not eaten since morning, and the small bread from the cafe now seemed like a distant memory. Hunger always gnawed at her, but fear made it worse. She had learned long ago that panic could be more dangerous than empty stomachs. So she forced herself to breathe slowly, counting each breath. Imagining each inhale, bringing her courage, and each exhale, taking away the terror. The sound of movement above her had startled her earlier, but now it became a strange source of hope. She imagined someone walking nearby, someone who might notice the darkness and call for help. She strained her ears, listening to every footstep, every faint sound of life outside the pit. But all she heard were muffled voices, distant laughter, and the faint clinking of glass from somewhere above. It was a reminder of the world continuing without her, a world full of celebrations she could not attend, of lives moving forward while she remained trapped. She tried to shift her position, moving carefully over the uneven ground. Broken wood, scraps of paper, and old cans made every movement a struggle. She felt cuts on her hands from sharp edges and bruises from falling objects, but she ignored them. Pain was familiar to her. Fear was not. Fear was new, and it burned hotter. She pulled her knees closer to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, rocking slightly. She told herself that as long as she kept moving, she was still alive, and as long as she was alive, there was a chance for freedom. Her mind wandered back to her childhood, to the small moments of warmth and love that had once made her feel safe. She remembered the mornings when her mother would wake her with a gentle touch, the smell of fresh bread from a tiny oven, the laughter of her younger siblings. Those memories were bittersweet. They reminded her that life had once been better, but they also reminded her of everything she had lost. She held on to them tightly as though they were small flames keeping the darkness at bay. Time passed in strange ways. The pit was silent except for her whispers and the occasional sound of rats scurrying in the corners. She tried to keep herself busy, rearranging small piles of trash, imagining them as something else: a bed, a small home, a place of safety. She counted the number of cans in each pile, the number of broken boxes, and even tried to make a small pattern in the dirt. These small acts gave her a sense of control in a situation where she had none. The first signs of fear came not from hunger or darkness, but from silence itself. The pit was alive with smells and textures, but there were no voices to answer her cries. She had shouted before, hoping someone might hear her, but no one had come. She imagined that no one cared, that she was invisible, that the world had moved on without even noticing her absence. Her heart ached with loneliness. She closed her eyes and tried to remember the small joys of life flowers in the park, sunlight on her face, the sound of children laughing, even in despair. She found moments of gratitude. She was alive, and that meant there was still a chance. She remembered small lessons from life: how to find water in strange places, how to stay warm even with thin clothing, how to make a small fire using scraps. She could not do all of those things in this pit, but remembering them gave her strength. Strength was not the absence of fear. Strength was moving forward despite it. Her thoughts drifted to the people above. She could hear faint voices, the laughter of workers, the sound of music. A wedding was happening somewhere nearby, a life of joy and celebration that seemed completely out of reach. She could imagine the women in fine dresses, the men in polished shoes, and the tables filled with food she could not even dream of. There was a cruel irony in the contrast between their lives and hers, and yet she did not allow herself to hate them. She did not blame individuals for the cruelty of the world. The world itself was unjust, and she had learned that blaming people accomplished nothing. Hours passed, and her body grew weaker. Hunger was sharp now, stabbing through her chest and making her stomach twist painfully. Her legs cramped, and her hands ached from holding herself upright. Yet she did not give up. She whispered small prayers, not for miracles, but for endurance. She prayed to survive another hour, another minute, another second. She prayed for someone to notice, for someone to care, for someone to remember that she was a human being, not a problem to be ignored. Then she heard a new sound, a faint shuffle, different from the voices and laughter she had grown accustomed to. Her heart leaped. She pressed her hands to the ground, listening intently. The sound grew slightly louder, a rhythm she could not place. Could it be someone looking for her? She whispered, calling out softly this time, careful not to make too much noise but desperate for attention. Please, someone. Her voice was barely audible, swallowed by the darkness. She waited, holding her breath. The sound of movement stopped. Silence returned. Disappointment washed over her like a wave. Her shoulders sagged, and she felt tears stinging her eyes. She pressed her hands over her face, trying to hold back sobs. For a moment, she felt completely alone, as if the world had abandoned her entirely. But she remembered the small flames of hope she had carried in her mind memories. Stories, dreams, and she clung to them like lifelines. Night came slowly, the pit growing colder with each passing hour. She huddled in a corner, wrapping her arms around herself, shivering not just from the cold but from exhaustion. She thought about her family again, wondering if they were worried, if anyone had noticed she was missing. The thought made her stomach tighten. She had no way to call out, no way to reach them. Yet she held on to the hope that someone, somewhere, might remember her, might search for her, might fight for her. The darkness pressed in even more as her thoughts grew sharper, more vivid. She remembered the kindness of strangers, moments when someone had offered her a small loaf of bread or a kind word. Those small gestures seemed like miracles now. She remembered the day a woman had given her a warm coat during winter. The warmth of it against her skin, the way it had made her feel seen. Those memories were precious, reminders that not all people were cruel, not all hearts were hardened by wealth or power. Her mind wandered to the faint sound she had heard earlier. She imagined it as a promise, a sign that help might be near. She imagined a hand reaching down, a voice calling her name, someone who could pull her out of the pit and return her to life. She allowed herself to imagine the relief of sunlight on her face, the freedom of walking without fear, the joy of feeling safe once more. Those imagined moments were fragile, but they were all she had, and she clung to them desperately. Time became meaningless. She no longer knew if hours or days had passed. Hunger, cold, and exhaustion blurred together, leaving her in a strange half-dream, where memories and reality mixed. Yet in the depths of her mind, one thought remained clear. She must survive. She had survived worse than this. Life had taught her resilience, had taught her that even in the darkest moments, a small spark of hope could grow into light. She focused on that thought, letting it guide her through the endless darkness. Suddenly, there was a change. She heard footsteps again, closer this time, deliberate and cautious. Her heart raced. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to make herself small, trying to stay quiet. But the footsteps did not stop outside the pit. There was a pause, a moment of silence. And then the sound of something moving, metal scraping, a voice speaking softly to someone else. Words she could not understand. Hope surged inside her, stronger than it had been all day. Someone was near. Someone was paying attention. She called out again, louder this time, her voice trembling. Please help me. I'm here. The sound of her own voice startled her, raw and fragile as it echoed off the walls. She waited, holding her breath, praying that someone would respond, praying that she had not imagined it all. And then, faintly, she heard a voice. Not a shout, not a command, but a question, curious and soft. She could not make out the words clearly, but it was enough. It was a sign that she was no longer invisible. Her heart leaped with fragile hope. She whispered her thanks, her gratitude, her prayers all at once. Though she knew no one could hear them yet, the hours stretched on, but for the first time, she felt a spark of certainty. She was not completely alone. Somewhere above, someone had noticed her. Somewhere above, someone had felt that something was wrong. That knowledge carried her through the long night, carrying her through hunger, exhaustion, and fear. She held on to it like a lifeline, imagining the moment when the light would return, when the pit would open, and when she could finally step out into the world again. The night outside the pit was alive with sounds, though she could only imagine them. The music from the wedding still floated faintly through the air. The laughter of guests like a cruel reminder of the world she could not touch. She pressed herself against the wall, shivering from the cold. But her mind had begun to notice something new, a sound different from before. Footsteps above, deliberate and careful, not like the guards she knew were nearby. She held her breath, listening. They moved slowly, almost as if whoever it was were trying not to disturb anything. Her heart beat faster. Could it be someone who cared? Someone who might help? She whispered again, her voice small but full of hope. "Please help me." The words felt fragile like glass. But sending them into the air gave her courage she did not know she had left above ground. Abel Gren, the billionaire, had noticed something strange. He had arrived at the wedding early, as he often did, though he rarely paid attention to the small details of such events. But tonight, something tugged at him, a faint unease he could not explain. The staff moved briskly around him, but their hurried gestures and nervous glances made him pause. Something was off. He could not say what exactly, only that the feeling in his chest told him to look closer, to pay attention. He wandered through the hallways and staircases near the back of the building, his instincts guiding him. The air smelled of flowers, fresh paint, and cooked food. But beneath it was something different, a faint sour odor that made him wrinkle his nose. It was subtle, easily ignored, yet impossible for him to overlook entirely. His curiosity grew stronger with each step, and though no one questioned his movements, he was, after all, a billionaire in a world where power meant immunity. He still felt a sense of urgency he could not explain. Back in the pit, she felt the vibrations of someone moving above her. The sounds were not consistent like the footsteps of guards. They were deliberate, slower, as if someone were searching for something, or someone. Her heart raced. She tried to stand, but her legs trembled beneath her. Hunger and exhaustion made every small movement a struggle. Still, she called out again, her voice breaking slightly from dryness and fear. "Please, someone." Above, the billionaire stopped near the back wall, frowning at the slightly raised metal door. It was old, rusted, and clearly long neglected. He could see a gap at the bottom, small enough that most would ignore it, but he bent down to peer closer. The smell grew stronger, a stench that made him wrinkle his nose. Still, curiosity drove him onward. Something was hidden here. Something needed attention. He could feel it. He pressed his hand gently on the door, trying to listen. The softest of sounds met him: movement, a shuffle, a faint whisper. His brow furrowed. He could not make out the words, but it was enough to tell him that someone was inside. He glanced at the guards nearby. "What's back here?" he asked. His voice was calm, but carried authority. The guards shifted nervously. "Nothing, sir." "Just storage," one said quickly, avoiding his gaze. They knew better than to argue, but their unease was clear. He frowned. "Open it," he said simply. His tone left no room for argument. The guards hesitated, but they obeyed. One of them bent to unlock the rusty latch, pulling the door open with effort. The smell hit him immediately, but so did the sight. In the corner of the pit, barely visible in the dim light, was a young woman. She was small, huddled against herself, her clothes torn and dirty, her eyes wide with fear. Time seemed to freeze. The billionaire's mind raced. He had seen many things in his life: trouble, suffering, injustice, but nothing like this. The sheer vulnerability of the girl, the cruelty she had endured, struck him deeply. He crouched slightly, careful not to startle her. "Hey," he said softly. Not a command, not a question, but a simple acknowledgement. "It's okay. You're safe now." She blinked up at him, unsure if she could trust anyone. Her voice was a whisper, barely audible. Who are you?" "Someone who wants to help," he replied gently. He looked around at the pit, at the broken furniture and rotting trash. You shouldn't be here. How long have you been stuck like this? Her lips trembled, and tears rolled down her cheeks. I don't know. Hours, maybe. Her voice broke completely. She could not even say the time, not that it mattered. She only knew she had been trapped, alone, at the mercy of people who did not care. He nodded, his mind already planning the next steps. I'm going to get you out, he said. Don't worry. His voice was firm but calm, a stark contrast to the fear that had filled the pit. He signaled for the guards to help lift her gently, making sure they did not hurt her. The girl's body shook as they lifted her. Every muscle ached, every joint screamed, but she did not resist. There was a strange mixture of relief and disbelief in her eyes. She could not yet comprehend that someone had noticed her, that someone cared enough to intervene. The air outside the pit smelled different, clean, warm, alive. She breathed it in deeply, tears streaming down her face. Once she was safely out, the billionaire knelt beside her. He did not lecture, did not ask questions harshly. He simply offered a hand, a presence of calm in a world that had shown her only cruelty. You're safe now, he repeated. She nodded, barely able to speak, overwhelmed by the sudden shift from fear to security. He noticed the small cuts on her hands, the bruises on her arms, and the dirt that covered her from head to toe. He made a mental note to ensure she received care, to make sure she was not only safe, but healed. He also noticed the strength in her posture, despite everything. She had endured so much, yet she had survived. That strength impressed him deeply. As they walked away from the pit, he asked softly, Can you tell me what happened? She shook her head, tears still streaming. I don't. I didn't do anything. I don't understand. Her voice was trembling, filled with fear and confusion. The words tumbled out in fragments, but the message was clear. She had been punished for being poor, for existing in a world that had no room for someone like her. He listened patiently, not interrupting, letting her tell as much or as little as she could. The story came out slowly, how she had been accused falsely, how the guards had locked her in the pit, how she had struggled in darkness, how she had feared she might not survive. Every detail deepened his concern and his determination. Once they reached a safer space, he ensured she was given clean water and a warm blanket. She sat quietly, shivering, her mind still processing the events. For the first time that day, she felt a small spark of safety, a fragile but real sense that she might actually survive. The billionaire watched her, thinking about the injustice she had endured, and he felt a deep need to make sure nothing like this happened to her or anyone else again. He did not rush her for details, understanding that trauma needed time. Instead, he spoke softly about small things, about the world outside, about simple comforts, about the fact that she had survived. He emphasized that the world could be cruel, but not everyone was heartless. Slowly, she began to relax, her body and mind responding to the first kindness she had experienced in so long. Through the night, he stayed nearby, ensuring no one interfered, ensuring she was not alone. She began to speak in small sentences, telling fragments of her life, her work, her family, her struggles. Each word was a release, a shedding of the fear that had wrapped around her like a second skin. He listened carefully, giving her space to share and validating her experiences with simple acknowledgments. For the first time since being trapped, hope that someone would see her, hear her, and believe in her. Hope that the world could be more than the darkness she had endured. She realized that even amidst cruelty, there were people who could act with compassion, who could notice what others ignored. And in that moment, she clung to that hope with all her heart, knowing that her life might be changing. One small step at a time, the billionaire made plans quietly. He would not leave her to face the world alone. He would ensure she was cared for, and he would investigate what had happened, demanding answers and accountability. For her, he could not undo the pain, but he could ensure that the people responsible faced consequences, that no one else would suffer the same fate. And as the night deepened, with the sounds of celebration fading into the distance, she finally allowed herself to rest. Wrapped in a blanket and safe in the knowledge that someone saw her, truly saw her, for the first time. For the first time, she believed that she could survive not just the night, but the cruelty she had endured for so long. And somewhere in the shadows of the building, someone who had once been invisible had finally begun to step into the light. The first moments after being rescued were almost surreal. She sat wrapped in a blanket, shivering but slowly feeling the warmth of safety. The smell of clean air, of something other than decay, filled her senses. And for the first time that day, she could breathe without fear. The billionaire stayed nearby, watching her carefully, making sure she was truly safe. He had seen cruelty before, but nothing had struck him like the sight of this young woman, trapped and terrified. Punished for nothing but the misfortune of being poor, she tried to speak, to explain, but the words were tangled in her throat. The fear had not entirely left her, and even now, surrounded by safety, she could not stop imagining herself back in the pit, alone and helpless. She shook her head, unable to speak clearly, and tears ran down her face. "It's okay," he said gently. "You don't have to explain everything right now. Just breathe. You're safe." Slowly, she nodded, taking a small sip of water he offered. The cold liquid felt like a miracle, and she drank carefully, afraid that even this comfort might disappear. Every sensation, the blanket, the water, the quiet voice of someone who cared felt overwhelming. She had survived hunger, darkness, and fear. But kindness was something entirely different. Something she had almost forgotten existed. The billionaire motioned for a nearby staff member to bring a small chair and a light. They set up a corner where she could rest, and he made sure no one would disturb her. Then he turned to the guards who had locked her in the pit. Their faces were pale, and they avoided his gaze. "What happened back there?" he asked calmly but firmly. One of them stammered. We thought she was stealing, sir. We thought she needed to be taught a lesson." "You thought it was acceptable to lock her in a trash pit?" The billionaire's voice rose slightly, not with anger, but with controlled intensity. "Do you understand the danger you put her in? Do you understand what could have happened?" The guards looked at one another, guilt and fear clear in their eyes. They had followed orders before, punished the vulnerable, and avoided questions. But now, faced with someone who could not be ignored, they realized the severity of their actions. We didn't know, sir," one said finally. "We thought we were doing the right thing." "You didn't know?" The billionaire shook his head slowly. "You put a human life at risk. You humiliated her. You endangered her. And for what? Because she was poor?" The girl listened quietly, unsure if she could believe the words being spoken. After hours of fear of being invisible, of enduring cruelty, someone was finally speaking for her, defending her, acknowledging what she had suffered. She wanted to say something, to express gratitude, but words failed her. Instead, she simply held on to the blanket tighter, allowing herself to feel for the first time that someone truly cared. He knelt beside her again, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You didn't deserve this," he said softly. "No one should ever be treated this way. You are not at fault." Her lips trembled, and she whispered, "I didn't do anything." "I know," he replied. "And now you are free from this. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Even as he spoke, the staff began to murmur among themselves. Word spread quickly through the building that someone had been trapped in the pit. Curiosity and shock spread, drawing people to the scene. Many were silent, unsure what to say. Others whispered angrily to one another, realizing the severity of what had occurred. The scene had shifted the world that had ignored her, that had allowed her suffering to continue, was suddenly paying attention. The billionaire took careful steps to ensure she was not overwhelmed by the crowd. He guided her to a quieter room, away from curious eyes, giving her space to regain her strength. He asked again if she could tell her story, knowing it was important that the truth be heard, but also understanding that she might need time. She took a deep breath, trembling as memories of the pit rushed back. She spoke slowly, haltingly, describing the guards, the false accusations, the darkness, the stench, and the fear. Each word brought a wave of pain, but also a release. Finally, someone was listening. Finally, someone believed her. As she spoke, he listened carefully, nodding at appropriate moments, allowing her to guide the story. He did not interrupt, did not question her sincerity, and most importantly, he did not judge. For the first time in hours, she felt that her experiences mattered, that her voice could be heard, and that she had some control over her story. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Even those who had been skeptical or dismissive of her existence felt the weight of her words. The cruelty she had endured, the sheer bravery it had taken to survive alone in the pit, left no room for doubt. She had been punished for nothing, and yet she had survived. And her story demanded attention. The billionaire stood and addressed the gathered staff. "This cannot happen again," he said firmly. "No one has the right to treat another human being like this, regardless of their circumstances. There will be consequences for the people responsible, and there will be changes to prevent it from happening in the future." Some staff shifted uneasily, but the gravity of his words was clear. Actions had consequences, and this time, no one would be able to ignore the injustice. The girl listened quietly, her mind slowly absorbing the reality of the situation. For hours, she had felt invisible, powerless, and abandoned. Now she felt seen, and the weight of that recognition was almost overwhelming. She had survived, but the survival alone was no longer enough. For the first time, she realized that she could also demand justice, not just for herself, but for others who might suffer in silence, even as she recovered physically. The emotional impact lingered. The fear, the humiliation, and the trauma of being trapped could not vanish instantly. But with the billionaire's support and the acknowledgement of those around her, she began to feel the first glimmers of hope. She realized that her life could change, that the darkness she had endured was not the end of her story, but perhaps the beginning of something different. Over the next few hours, medical attention was provided. She was cleaned up, given food, and allowed to rest. Each small act warmth, nourishment, comfort felt monumental after the horrors she had faced. The billionaire stayed nearby, ensuring she was treated with dignity, not just as a victim, but as a human being deserving of care and respect. As the evening approached, he began asking more about her life, carefully, without pressure. He wanted to understand her world, her struggles, and how she had survived so much. She spoke hesitantly at first, then more freely, sharing stories of the work she did, the people she trusted, the moments of kindness that had kept her going. She described her dreams, simple ones at first: having enough food, a safe place to sleep, and the chance to live without fear. Listening to her, he felt a deep responsibility. It was not enough to rescue her from the pit. The world she lived in was still harsh and unforgiving. He knew he had the power to make a real difference, not just in her life, but for others like her. He resolved that the injustice she had suffered would lead to change, that her story would not be forgotten, and that the people who had caused her suffering would be held accountable. As night fell, the building quieted. The wedding guests had long since gone, leaving only the lingering echoes of celebration. She sat quietly, wrapped in a blanket, feeling the weight of the day finally settling on her. Exhaustion pulled at her, but so did a new sense of possibility. For the first time, she felt that her life could move forward, that the world could offer more than fear and cruelty. The billionaire checked on her one last time before leaving for the night. "Rest," he said softly. "Tomorrow, we will make sure things are handled. You don't have to do this alone." She nodded, too tired to speak. Sleep came slowly, haunted by memories of the pit, but also filled with the faintest light of hope. She dreamed of walking in the sun, of feeling safe, of finally being recognized as a human being worthy of respect. In the quiet of the night, the truth had come to light. The cruelty she had endured could no longer be ignored. The world above the pit had finally seen her suffering, and someone with power and compassion had chosen to act. For the first time, she understood that survival alone was not enough. What mattered was being heard, being seen, and being given the chance to rebuild. And though the journey ahead would be long, filled with challenges she could not yet imagine. She had taken the first steps out of darkness. She had survived the pit. She had been recognized. And the world, for the first time that day, had begun to respond. The morning sun rose slowly, filling the room with soft, warm light. She stirred under the blanket, blinking at the brightness. For the first time in what felt like forever, she did not feel trapped. The pit was behind her, a nightmare that had become a memory. And for the first time, she could imagine a future that was not dictated by fear. The billionaire was already awake. Reviewing the plans for the day, he had spent the night making arrangements not just for her care, but for accountability. The people responsible for locking her in the pit would face consequences. He had contacted authorities and internal management, ensuring that justice would be served. But he had also made arrangements for her well-being. She would have a safe place to stay, access to food, medical attention, someone to help guide her through the days ahead. When she finally opened her eyes, he greeted her with a gentle nod. "Good morning," he said softly. "How do you feel?" Tired, sore, and a little afraid, she tried to smile. "Better, I think," she whispered. "I never thought someone would." "Notice me. You are seen," he said firmly. "And that will not change. You do not have to hide, and you do not have to be afraid anymore." She looked at him, a strange mixture of gratitude and disbelief on her face. It was hard to imagine that someone so powerful could care so deeply. In her world, people were either cruel or indifferent, and yet here was someone using their influence not to gain more power or wealth, but to protect her, to right a wrong, and to restore her dignity. The day moved slowly, but it was filled with small victories. She met a doctor who checked her injuries and made sure she had everything she needed to recover physically. She received clean clothes and food, simple things that felt luxurious after the harsh reality of the pit. Each bite of bread, each sip of water, each small comfort reminded her that life could be gentle, that survival was not the only thing she deserved. Meanwhile, the billionaire worked quietly but relentlessly. He met with managers, questioned guards, and reviewed the security procedures that had allowed such cruelty to happen. His presence alone made it clear that negligence would not be tolerated. He listened carefully to the details, and he did not accept excuses. The woman had been punished for being poor, and that was unacceptable. Those responsible would face disciplinary action. He made sure that no one could claim ignorance as a defense. Throughout the day, she observed all of this quietly. It was strange to see someone take her story seriously, to see action taken on her behalf. She had learned that life could be unfair, but she had also learned that fairness, when it appeared, was powerful. She began to feel a small spark of confidence. Maybe she could reclaim her own life. Maybe she could rebuild what had been broken. He also made sure she had a safe place to stay, away from those who had harmed her. She moved into a small apartment arranged by him, simple but clean and warm. It was her own space, for the first time in years, where she could sleep without fear, eat without worry, and think without anxiety pressing down on her. Each night, she fell asleep feeling protected. The darkness of the pit replaced by the warmth of safety. As days turned into weeks, her recovery progressed. She regained strength in her body, and gradually her mind began to heal. The trauma of being trapped in the pit lingered, of course, but each small act of normalcy, making a meal, taking a walk in the sunlight, talking with someone who listened, helped her rebuild the pieces of herself that had been broken. The billionaire visited regularly, not to patronize her, but to ensure she was supported. He encouraged her to speak about her experiences, to trust again, and to pursue the simple joys of life she had been denied. Slowly, she began to believe in herself again. She allowed herself to dream, not just about surviving, but about living. One afternoon, she sat by the window of her new apartment, watching people walk by in the streets below. Life moved quickly around her, just as it always had, but now she felt part of it rather than excluded from it. She reflected on what had happened, the fear and pain of the pit, and the unexpected kindness that had saved her. She realized that life was unpredictable, sometimes cruel, sometimes unexpectedly generous, and that she had endured far more than most could imagine. News of the incident spread quietly through the community. The pit, once a place of shame and fear, had become a symbol of courage and survival. People spoke about the young woman who had endured so much and survived. The story inspired others to pay attention to injustice, to speak up when they saw cruelty, and to believe in the power of compassion. She began to take small steps toward independence. She applied for work with the guidance of the billionaire and his team, wanted to ensure she had opportunities without exploitation. She learned new skills, gaining confidence as she realized that she could not only survive, but thrive. Each day brought a new challenge, but also a new opportunity. She faced each one with courage. Drawing strength from the ordeal she had endured and the kindness she had been shown, the guards and staff who had locked her in the pit were held accountable. Some lost their positions, others were disciplined and educated on the consequences of their actions. The billionaire ensured that their treatment of her was documented and used as a lesson for others. He wanted to create a system where the vulnerable could no longer be punished silently, where cruelty could not hide behind the pretense of authority or routine. Over time, she rebuilt relationships with her family, reconnecting with the people who had worried about her during her absence. The fear that had kept her isolated began to fade. She discovered that trust, once broken, could slowly be mended, especially when supported by genuine care and action. She realized that her life, though shaped by hardship, could also be defined by resilience, courage, and the kindness of those who chose to act. Even months later, she remembered the pit, the darkness, and the stench of decay. She remembered the fear, the loneliness, and the sense of invisibility. But she also remembered the small sparks of hope, the vibrations of footsteps above, the gentle voice that reassured her, the hand that guided her to safety. Those memories, though painful, became a source of strength, a reminder that she had endured and survived. The billionaire continued to support initiatives to protect vulnerable people. Inspired by her story, he expanded programs to provide shelter, medical care, and protection for those at risk. Her experience became a catalyst for change, ensuring that fewer people would suffer in silence. Her life, once defined by struggle, became a force for awareness, compassion, and action. She often thought about the day she had been rescued, about the moment someone saw her suffering and acted. That memory reminded her that even in a world that could be cruel, there was always the possibility for goodness. She carried that lesson forward, treating others with kindness, advocating for those who were ignored, and never forgetting the fragility of life and the strength of resilience. Slowly, she reclaimed joy in small moments, walking in sunlight, sharing meals with friends, laughing without fear. Each step, each choice, each act of self-care was a declaration of her survival. The pit had taken much from her, but it could not take her courage, her hope, or her determination to live fully. And one day, standing by the window and watching the world move around her, she realized she had been transformed. The girl who had been invisible, trapped, and humiliated was now someone who had faced fear and cruelty and emerged stronger. She had been seen, she had been heard, and she had been given a chance to rebuild her life. Her journey had been harsh and painful, but it had also revealed something important. Even in darkness, light could reach those who were willing to hold on to hope. And she had held on. The world had finally acknowledged her pain, and in doing so, it had allowed her to reclaim her place within it. She smiled softly, a smile born not just of relief, but of strength, resilience, the knowledge that she had survived and would continue to thrive on her own terms. Her story, once defined by suffering, was now defined by courage, hope, and the possibility of a future she could shape herself. She had endured the pit, she had been rescued, and she had discovered that life, despite its hardships, could still be beautiful, just, and full of promise. And so she moved forward, step by step, into a life she had fought to claim, with the quiet knowledge that survival was only the beginning, and that true strength lay in embracing the future with courage, dignity, and hope.